I'm Mark Halperin.
And I'm John Heilemann. And with all due respect to Ben Carson, who's having a little trouble remembering that West Point conversation, come on, dude. It's not brain surgery. Happy Military Academy Appreciation Day, sports fans. In our boot camp regimen tonight, Keystone exercises, Rubio reflexes, and debate stage gymnastics. But first, the Carson mud crawl. Forget the pyramids thing, forget the belt buckle stabbing thing. Today, Ben Carson is in trouble in an area that you really shouldn't mess with in a Republican primary, the military. Carson has said in his books and in interviews that he was offered a full ride to West Point after meeting General William Westmoreland. But today, Politico reported that West Point has no record that Carson applied to the school or was extended a formal offer. The Carson campaign says that Carson was told at the time that he would be accepted to the school if he applied, but he chose to go elsewhere. That would be Yale. And Carson, who has previously said that he only applied to the aforementioned Yale, said this today on Sean Hannity's radio program when asked to explain this version of events.
And at one of these dinners, at some point, you met General Westmoreland.
Right.
Did you ever say that he offered you a full scholarship to the military academy?
No, I don't remember who the people were. There were multiple military people that I talked to. I mean, again, we're talking almost 50 years ago. There's just no way I'm going to remember who they are.
Yeah, and the big point of the story was, well, West Point never has a record of you applying. Did you ever say you applied?
No, I didn't. I quashed it right away. I said I was very honored, but I'm going to be a doctor.
So, Mark, in the realm of political misleadingness, how egregious do you consider this, and what do you think are the political ramifications?
We still don't have the facts. So later in the show, we're going to talk to a close advisor to Dr. Carson, Armstrong Williams. Maybe we'll get some more facts. The way the story broke on Politico, the way they quoted Dr. Carson's campaign manager was at least a little bit misleading. And I think now, based on what we know, that while Dr. Carson left the impression with people that he was offered a scholarship, a free ride to West Point, that in fact, if you look at what he said, he wasn't all that misleading. Conservative media is circling the wagons. I think there's a good chance that this story is dead by Sunday morning.
Boy, we are going to enter the disagreement zone now. Well, I think the Politico headline was ridiculous. The idea that they had admitted to fabricating. They had clearly not admitted or to fabricating. So let's put aside the Politico headline. He didn't leave people with the impression that he was offered a scholarship. In his book, he said he was offered a full scholarship. On interviews years later, he said he was offered a full scholarship. He said all of those things until now at the New York Times and other states saying, well, I didn't really mean I was offered in any formal sense a full scholarship. I think that this is not the worst example of this kind of thing I've ever seen, but those are pretty. I mean, offered a full scholarship means something. Doesn't mean you were somebody suggested.
What he said to the New York Times today was, it was an informal, with a record like yours, we could get you a scholarship. If I were a great high school basketball player and Dean Smith said to me, you're awesome, I want you to come to North Carolina. If you apply, you'll get in. Of course, you'll get a full scholarship. And then I end up not applying and applying to Yale. He said, I still could say.
I don't think I received an offer.
I turned down.
Yes, you could say that, but I would never say, if I didn't get a letter from my college saying, sir, you are now admitted to this school, you have an offer of a scholarship, well, I would never say the word offer. So, that's a very hard word.
I think they're acknowledging that language in the book and the way he's used it has not been
sloppy.
Precise. But it certainly has opened the door, not just this, but some of the other stories this week, to a lot of elites and a lot of media people, and certainly the people in the other campaigns who want Carson to fall, to say he's got a trouble with the truth. And he's going to have to deal with that, with elites.
So yes, for sure. Look, that is where we move to the second part of our question, the political ramifications. Yesterday on this program, when we were talking about the Egypt thing versus the book thing, the background thing, I said that when the vetting starts, if there's holes in his story, which has not been fully examined, there's going to be problems. Today, there are problems, and I anticipate now, as we know how the media works, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be scouring for every detail, and if there are other stories, he's going to be in big trouble.
There are other stories. I'll just say, to go past the bell, I will say that he's going to have to prove to Elise he doesn't have a trouble with the truth, but the media, in this case Politico, made a mistake because conservatives are circling the wagons, and it's going to give him a pass on a lot of stuff.
No excuse for the headline. I agree with that.
We'll have more on this, as I said, in the next segment with Armstrong Williams, a close advisor to Dr. Carson. But moving on to the other big political story of the day, Keystone is dead, formally buried today by President Obama, who rejected the Keystone XL pipeline a project that would have extended from Canada to Texas and which has been a political firebomb ticking for the last 7 years. At the White House today, Mr. Obama made his case for why the pipeline is and was a bad idea.
The pipeline would not make a meaningful long-term contribution to our economy. So if Congress is serious about wanting to create jobs, this was not the way to do it.
Almost all the Republican presidential candidates were ready to react since this decision was expected. Mike Huckabee said President Obama has, quote, lost his mind. Bobby Jindal blamed, quote, science-denying radicals, and Jeb Bush called the decision a self-inflicted attack on the American economy. John, given that this has been long expected, given the partisan divide here, is this going to have any impact on the American political system and progress and future at writ large?
Well, I think if you understand why Obama did this, and the Republicans are right when they say this is largely a political decision. The president's view of this is that the environmental harms are relatively modest if it had gone through, and the jobs impact was also relatively modest. So he wasn't really, like, this was going to change the economy, so also wasn't going to ruin the environment. But what was clear was that he didn't want to upset environmentalists and get no credit from Republicans on the other side. That was his calculus. And the reason, and he wants to energize the Democratic base. I think this is designed to do that, and it probably will have some effect in that regard. It would have been bad in the other way from the Democratic point of view had he gone the other direction.
There's a bunch of issues that Democrats have not been as strong on electorally as they thought they would be in past elections. Guns, gay rights, environment. It's going to be interesting to see, because Hillary Clinton is going to emerge, or Bernie Sanders is going to emerge as a Democratic nominee in all likelihood, having moved pretty far to the left on those three issues.
Yes.
And on this issue, Republicans have a chance now to make their case to how to be good stewards of the environment, but also create jobs.
And if they can somehow make the case about that first part, good stewards of the environment, I would love to hear that case. Not heard it really very compellingly made in the past. But look, the Democratic Party now united on this. Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, Barack Obama. And they are going to use it to try to drive turnout in the fall of 2016.
And, of course, if growth is still 2%, the people who argue that we need to lean more in the direction of economic growth over protecting the environment are going to have a stronger hand. Because right now, the reason why cap and trade failed, the reason why the president is not going to pay a huge political price for this despite the polls, is because people are worried about the economy now. They're still looking for more robust growth. They're looking for decisions that will create jobs, not cost jobs.
I would say on the merits, though, if you think about it, my premise at the beginning on the merits, this was not something, despite all Republican claims to the contrary, that was going to be a giant job-creating project.
In the short term.
Not a giant one, not one that materially improves the economy, not one that changes the unemployment rate. It would have not been any of those things. It would have been, you would have had some jobs. Those are important jobs. They are important. But there was some environmental harm or some environmental risk. Yeah, that's kind of a wash on the merits, as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, Marco Rubio is still the hot candidate of the week. And in a CNN ORC poll released today, he's in third place in Iowa. That's pretty good, with 13% behind just Ben Carson and Donald Trump. He's now such a big target, because he's rising, that he is facing fire from three very different entities. Number one is the Democratic National Committee, which is hitting Rubio on that Republican Party-issued corporate credit card. No, wait, not a credit card. It was an American Express charge card. Number two, there's Jeb Bush, who's going after Rubio again for missing a lot of Senate votes. And then number three, there's Ted Cruz's super PAC, the, quote, Courageous Conservatives PAC, which is running radio ads in Iowa targeting Rubio's record on immigration.
We all loved how Marco Rubio took apart Jeb Bush in the debate. Wasn't it great? But what's Rubio ever done? Anything? Other than his Gang of 8 amnesty bill, can anyone think of anything Marco Rubio's ever done? Anything at all besides amnesty? Marco Rubio looks good on TV, but that's about it. Ted Cruz for president.
My question for you is, Marco Rubio facing all these assaults from the left to the far right, and in the middle, how dangerous is that for him to have that array?
It's a trade-off. The downside is that you just see a lot of information getting to voters along the same thing, and a lot of voters aren't necessarily going to focus on where it's coming from. The upside for him is twofold. One is the thing's going to burn out. People are using these issues now. But the other thing is, every time a Republican does one of these attacks now, Rubio can say, for the base effectively, why is a Republican making a Democratic attack? These are all just part of the same desperate attacks because everybody thinks I'm doing well.
It's interesting, you think back to 2012, right, when Newt Gingrich and Rick Perry went after Mitt Romney on Bain. On one hand, he was able to say effectively that they were making Democratic arguments, and that shut him down in the context of the nomination fight. On the other hand, it ended up being an issue, raising an issue that did some damage to Romney in the long run when he got to the general election. And that's the kind of dynamic that's playing here. Same parallel.
Exact parallel. The thing I'll say is the merits will matter in the end.
Oh, yeah.
And there's a lot of people, even in the so-called mainstream media, who've looked at the Rubio financial issues, for instance, and said, this is not something that goes anywhere. Immigration, though, is going to come back. It's something he's going to have to deal with, and abortion. All right. The Fox Business Channel announced late yesterday that just 8 candidates are going to be on the main stage for its Republican debate on Tuesday. Both Chris Christie and Mike Huckabee have been demoted to that dreaded undercard contest, where they will join Kid Table Staples, Bobby Jindal, and Rick Santorum. Christie and Huckabee could not muster the 2.5% average of the 4 most recent national polls used by Fox to determine eligibility for the big debate. This means that the Big 8 on the main stage should get about 3 more minutes each of talk time on average. John, how else will the absence of Christie and Huckabee impact that debate on Tuesday?
Well, look, the absence of Huckabee, I think, doesn't matter very much. He has not been a big factor in these debates. The absence of Christie matters a lot because he's very good and can be very good. And particularly, I think it creates an opening for the other competitors in the establishment lane. This will give Jeb Bush a chance to shine in a different way. This will give Marco Rubio a chance to shine in a different way without having to compete in that same lane with Chris Christie, who can take up a lot of space, and I mean that in the right way.
The 3 establishment candidates, as I understand it, will be side by side by side, Kasich, Bush, and Rubio. Right. And that means, depending on how the moderators work this, you may get the most sort of distinct audition for the establishment slot that we've seen the whole time.
Right.
And with more time to talk, it's going to be fascinating to see. And obviously, this means that Christie would have been kind of an attacker, I think, to some extent on the other establishment.
At least
folks.
aggressive.
Yeah. That means this means I think Bush has another chance to figure out how he wants to talk about Rubio, and Kasich has another chance to kind of contrast himself within that lane.
Again, the stakes for Bush, as high as they were in the last debate and as devastating as it was the way he performed, will be even higher now because the opportunity and the pressure is even more. All right, up next, the candidate who might have been a West Point graduate. We will ask Ben Carson campaign advisor Armstrong Williams about the biggest story of the day when we come back in exactly 60 seconds.
I would say to the people of America, do you think I'm a pathological liar like CNN does? Or do you think I'm an honest person? And I'm going to leave that up to the American people to make that decision.
Today, Dr. Ben Carson and his campaign are dealing with that Politico report we talked about earlier about the candidate's history with the West Point Military Academy. Here to talk about that story and the campaign's response, and I hope clear a lot up, is one of Dr. Carson's closest advisors and friends, Armstrong Williams, who's with us now from our Washington bureau. Mr. Williams, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.
Mark and John, my pleasure to join you.
So I think, as we discussed earlier, part of this story really has been unfair to Dr. Carson as it's come out. But I want to focus on a few areas where there's some facts in dispute. First of all, do you concede that the language Dr. Carson has used, saying that he was offered a full scholarship, is at a minimum inaccurate and misleading?
No, we don't.
You don't. Okay. So as you know it, either from Dr. Carson or other sources, explain to us who offered him a full scholarship.
Well, Mark and John, the story was when he was in high school. It was back during the late 60s. And the details of the story was, of course, he was outstanding in ROTC. And there was this function where he recalled the details of General Westmoreland and others in attendance. They were aware of his high academic scores as a person in ROTC. They had a discussion about the fact that his scores would qualify him if he were interested in applying to West Point. It was sort of like the wink wink. We know what that is. If you apply, we're confident you'll get in. Now understand what getting in for any West Point applicant, if they are accepted, that is an automatic scholarship because all of your tuition is paid. Dr. Carson talked about how he pounded his chest and how he's flattered by it, but he realized that he only had $10, and in addition to this, he had all these other applications coming in, and he only had $10, and he made his gamble because he really wanted to attend Yale, He paid the $10, and he was accepted. He later on notified the people who were very gracious in that conversation that he would not be following up, he would not apply, because he was planning to attend Yale because his aspirations were to always become a physician.
Armstrong, just to go back to the question that Mark asked you a second ago, now, having heard that account, which Dr. Carson's given in other places and you've just given, how does that constitute an offer of any kind? That's what Dr. Carson has claimed in the past. He said he was offered, he wrote in his book that he was offered a full scholarship. He talked to Charlie Rose a month ago. He said, I was offered a full scholarship to West Point. Now in the New York Times, he says, it was an informal, with a record like yours, we could easily get you a scholarship to West Point. Those seem, to me at least, to be different things, an offer versus the account you just gave and the account he's now giving.
Well, John, that is an absolute fair point, but it's all about interpretation. If you are a 16-year-old kid, high school, and from the inner city, you have to consider the time. You're in these conversations with people that you're in awe with, and it's awe-inspiring, and they say we can get you in, and it means a scholarship. In his mind, he was offered a scholarship. If you fast forward to where we are today, somebody may interpret that differently, but sincerely he felt that if he had applied, that he sort of got this wink-wink, given his academic standard and how he was scoring, that he would have gotten that scholarship into West Point.
Armstrong, I overreacted to the Politico story. They've since changed their headline in some of the piece, and the account you're giving, I think, is very reasonable. And as we should make clear, Dr. Carson has also said in the past consistently he only applied to one school, Yale. That suggests that he could not have gotten a formal offer and a formal entrance. But I still go back to, because this kind of dovetails with the story about questions of his accounts about violence in his past. Be as specific as you can. Who said things to him that led him to believe that he had what the equivalent of a 16-year-old would look at as an offer? Was it Westmoreland or was it others?
You know, Dr. Carson, if you read the passages in his book, he mentions the fact, look, I am not going to, because of journalism and the integrity that people expect from all of us, try to interpret almost 50 years ago who was in that room and what caused Dr. Carson to interpret a full scholarship. He does recall it. He's told this story consistently. He's said it to me. I've been in his presence for the last 15 years.
Does he know the names of the people who he would cite? And you don't know them, or he can't remember, which would be reasonable.
No,
if he couldn't remember their names, but does he?
Mark, we're not saying that. Whatever's in that passage of his book, Gifted Hands, it is my recollection that he did mention names.
Well, he did, Armstrong. He mentioned General Westmoreland, for instance. And then again today, when he was on with Sean Hannity, he seemed to be backing away from any specifics. He sort of seems to, on one hand, have been making relatively specific claims in the book, and now sort of saying, well, I'm not really sure who it was that I mentioned. So is it the case that, I mean, again, everyone's entitled to a foggy memory about things that happened 50 years ago, but he was very precise in some of the accounts that he'd earlier given. So how do you explain that discrepancy?
John, it's one thing to give accounts when you're not under fire and you're not forced to recount that memory almost a half century ago. And I think what you heard today in his interview with Sean Hannity is that this issue has forced him to second-guess himself. Not the fact that it did not happen, but the fact that he may have muddled the details. He's not sure. And so all he's showing as a human characteristic is that he's moving forward with caution because he wants to make sure that what he says is accurate according to a memory of 50 years ago.
Okay, Armstrong, stand by. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about the more general issue of Dr. Carson and scrutiny and the truth right after this. We're back with Ben Carson advisor, Armstrong Williams. This week's ending with a lot of people in elite circles having this notion that there's this problem with Dr. Carson, that he's embroidered aspects of his life, that he's got trouble telling the truth, that he's not straightforward. I know you don't share that view, but I'm wondering what you would say to people who end this week looking at all these stories and saying, boy, there's some problem with this guy in terms of his biography and his fidelity to the truth.
Well, listen. You are a presidential candidate, John and Mark. You're the top-tier candidate. It should be expected that everything that you've ever written, everything you've ever said, whether it's on camera or among someone who may want to report it, is going to be vetted. And Dr. Carson has to expect this. And the difficulty, when you tell a story over 50 years ago, the story has a tendency to change into different variations. And sometimes, in all candor, gentlemen, you don't even remember the details of the story because you've been telling it for so long, and you've never been in a position where people feel that you need to be vetted on your details.
Armstrong,
and so you told the story.
Just testify to his character for the American people. And people are having doubts about his fidelity to the truth. Testify to that.
Look, John and Mark, look, I've known Dr. Carson, it seems like, for ages. I've never known Dr. Carson to say anything that is not to be true and honorable and something that he really believes. But sometimes you have to understand, we're human beings. This was a 17-year-old kid, a 19-year-old kid. They're kids. I mean, if you ask any of us to go back and try to remember what we said 10 years ago, it would be difficult. And given the information age and the way things have changed today, it becomes more rapidly to people. And for Dr. Carson, he's a man of character. He's just he's a decent man. And the last thing that Dr. Carson, if he felt that he were not transparent on the story and maybe he had muddled some facts, he would be the first to say so. And so what we have to say to Dr. Carson sometimes is that sometimes when you tell these stories, sometimes you may not remember the story as it was told. And so when somebody's going through the record, when you said this, and it may seem different because the story can change. And it's just human. It's not intentional. It's not malicious. It's just what happens when you keep telling the same story. It has the tendency to become something different.
So, Armstrong, let me ask you this question then. You just pointed out you're a top-tier candidate. Everything's going to come under scrutiny. This book, Gifted Hands, how much before today, how much had you and your colleagues who are working on this campaign, how much have you gone back, and how much do you plan to going forward go back and really look in a tough, investigative way at everything in the book so that you're ready for potential criticisms and questions that might come?
Well, for full disclosure, I'm not a part of the campaign and never will be. I'm his business manager, and I am a close advisor. John, that is a fair question. When you've written so much in volumes, whether at Johns Hopkins University or whether you're best-selling books or papers that you've written, when you're reading these books, guys, and you read so many things, you say, oh, this is something that may be a problem. No one could have ever imagined.
Armstrong, just quickly, how much work had been done previously? Had people done any of this preparation or not?
Yes. But until a story becomes a story and it's questioned, then you realize that you've got to vet those details, which you assume were not an issue when you did your vetting. So you never know. This takes on a life of itself. It takes on its own biology. And so what the campaign has to do, we just have to adjust to this and realize that there's probably more to come.
Okay, Armstrong, thank you very much. Very thoughtful explanation on behalf of your friend. We appreciate it. And we'll be right back with our polling guru, Ken Goldstein, after this word from our sponsors.
Joining us now to talk about the ad wars and some new polls is our polling and advertising Einstein. That would be Ken Goldstein down in the Washington Bureau. Ken, a lot of attention this week to these radio ads that Donald Trump and Ben Carson put on the air. How do those ads differ from other ones that you've heard in this cycle and from other campaigns?
Well, the first way they differ is I actually heard them because they generated a ton of coverage, including what we played before and what folks were playing all yesterday. It's really interesting. Right to Rise, Jeb Bush's super PAC, has spent $700,000 on radio advertising over the last couple of weeks. I follow this stuff. I couldn't tell you what his radio ad is, whereas Carson campaign, Trump campaign make some fairly modest investments, and they get probably millions of dollars in free media coverage.
Ken, we talked yesterday about the notion of radio as being a more targeted medium. If you're a Republican presidential candidate or super PAC supporting one, why is radio a better way to reach voters than TV sometimes?
So radio in general is a more targeted medium. But what's interesting that we hear about the wage gap or the gender gap, but there's also a GRP gap or an impressions gap when it comes to television. Democrats watch more television than Republicans. It's harder to reach Republicans on television. And on radio, what are the biggest drivers of radio ratings? Well, it's conservative talk radio and it's sports radio, both which skew male, both of those which skew white male, which are Republican targets.
In terms of message, Ken, are radio ads nastier, or are they different from TV ads, or very much the same?
Well, in the past, it's not like it's always pleasant when it's on television, and this past set of radio ads have been positive, but the old trick was to really air your negative stuff, your really nasty stuff on the radio. And again, that would be on both sides. So it would be Democrats trying to air things on urban stations aired towards African Americans that had a particularly strong language against Republicans, and Republicans airing their real negative stuff, their really nasty stuff on religious radio or on conservative talk radio. And the thought was none of us would be paying attention because we weren't listening to those medium, and so there would not be a backlash with that sort of message on the radio.
And of course, often campaigns won't even announce that they're putting on a radio ad, where they typically do, more often do on TV. Quickly to polling. You've seen a pattern now in the two kinds of polls in the Republican nomination fight. Live call polls where human beings call other potential voters versus automated calls. What's the pattern you're seeing there?
A very, very interesting pattern. So when you look at live caller phone polls, Ben Carson tends to be doing much better and often in the lead. When you look at either robocalls, where you're punching in a number on the phone, or an internet poll, Donald Trump is doing better. And if you look just this past week, NBC did its normal poll with the Wall Street Journal. In that poll, Ben Carson was up 6 percentage points, 6.5 percentage points. In the poll they do with SurveyMonkey, which was an online poll, released the very same day, the race was tied.
Ken, in
So
one
Trump
sentence,
doing better.
in one sentence, what's your theory about why that is? One sentence.
Oh, my God. My one sentence, I was afraid you were going to ask that. Is there something where people are shy to say they're voting for Donald Trump? Now, the question is, they get to do that in secret in a ballot box as well.
Yep.
That's two sentences, Ken, but pretty
With a
good nonetheless. Thank you very much, Mr. Albert Einstein of polling. When we come back, race, jazz, and Nolans, also sandwiches, according to Wendell Pierce from The Wire and Treme after this. Recently, we were joined by the incredibly excellent writer and actor Wendell Pierce. Most famously, he was the detective Bunk Moreland on The Wire, which of course is the greatest television show ever, and the trombonist Antoine Batiste on the show Treme, which is also pretty damn good. Wendell came in to talk to us about Race 2016 and his new book, which is about one of the greatest cities in the country, that would be New Orleans. And the book is called The Wind in the Reeds, a storm, a play, and the city that would not be broken. In the book, you talk about the city of New Orleans, and you talk about the two main characters in Waiting for Godot. And they're obviously constantly waiting for a savior to come. So right. The question is New Orleans still waiting for that?
No. One of the things that I point out in the book is it was an epiphany for me, an awakening for me when I did the play there, because it resonated with so many people that that's the thing that makes the play so classic, that while we wait for some entity outside of ourselves to come and define who we are and where we are going, it really is a lesson of learning that you have it within your own power. So New Orleanians have exercised their right of self-determination, realized that it's on us to redevelop our city, rebuild our lives, rebuild our communities, and we owe it to those people that lost their lives that we do that. So many people had given up on us. There were so many people who didn't have our best interests at heart. Those outside the city, and then there are those in the city also. Yeah. So people learned that they had to exercise their right of self-determination, or they would lose the very thing that they love about their life, their city, and their community.
One of the things that's so striking about you is that you are as politically active as you are and politically sophisticated as you are. When President Obama was elected, you took your parents to the inauguration.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Talk about that. What was that like?
You have to understand, my father fought in Saipan. risked his life for the country. Loved this country when this country wasn't loving him, came back, and his right to vote wasn't even protected. My mother grew up in the Bayou country of Louisiana, where the reason I'm a New Orleanian is because they didn't have schools for black kids in the Bayou. So you had to come to New Orleans. It was the only place where they had a black high school, where my mother graduated valedictorian in 1947. It was a place where it was violent to just live their lives there. And to see that in this country, the greatest triumph of President Obama's election was not what it did for African Americans, but what it said about the evolution of this country.
Right, sure.
To get rid of that sickness. And to have my parents be alive to see that. My father talked about how he cried when he sailed under the Golden Gate Bridge going to the Pacific Theater of War, thinking he would never see the country again, never see home again. And as we drove into D.C. that night, the night before the election, the inauguration, we drove around the mall, we were in tears because it was such a defining and beautiful moment for the country. And then my father was just in laughter. And I said, Daddy, what's going on? Well, what are you laughing about? This is such a moving moment. He goes, no, a black man is over all of this. So he was just having a ball. It was joyous.
So in your book, you are honest to a fault about the subject of race. I wonder if you think that in the course of his now 7 years now, almost fully 7 years in office, if you think President Obama has been honest about the topic of race?
I think the president has been politic. He knew that there was going to be an unfair expectation on him, being the first president of color, to be the one to have the conversation about race. But, James Baldwin always said the issue of race is not about black folks, it's a white folks problem. It really is a white folks
Chris
problem.
Rock said that too recently.
It's like, and so it's that concentration. I think the president has been politic about it. I think.
But does that disappoint you at all? I mean, there's varying views about this. We get African American guests in here. You talk to people. I absolutely talk to people all the time about this. I have about half the African Americans I talk to, totally understand that. They're keyed in on the politics. They say, I get why the president has had to take it slow. Others are impatient. Why didn't he start earlier? Why didn't he?
First of all,
Calvin O. Butts comes down here and says, if he had started this conversation in his first year, we might be in a really different place.
I don't have time for the conversation. Right? Let me as an artist try to change the heart and souls of people. I want you as a president to put policy in place that has an effect. I was aware of the policy that he was putting in place, that there was going to be a real concentration on changing the paradigm of really trying to move the country and move the needle. First of all, he had to save the country from a second depression. And I think it would have started earlier had, that turning of the ship happened sooner and faster. And then the freedom that a second term gives a president. Now everybody's going to look at this and wonder, why am I so politic? Besides being on a political show. The fact is, as an artist, this has always been a part of the nexus of culture in New Orleans. As I said, second lines coming from social aid and pleasure clubs, the literal creation of jazz coming from captured Africans with that African six, hearing the oom-pa-pa of their captors, finding their creative freedom before they found their physical freedom. Jazz. And it's an American aesthetic. Because within this confinement, I will find my individual freedom of expression of who I am, right? And until this culture actually will be the induction of insurrection. So I can find that freedom. And that's what makes jazz the quintessential American art form. Because with a finite amount of notes, it has an infinite amount of combinations. Within the confines and construct of law and order, the form of a song, you can find the individual improvisation and creativity of a solo, where both can be honored. And that's a completely American aesthetic. Technical proficiency, order, and law with individual expression. And that has always been at the nexus of culture in New Orleans.
That was just part of my talk with Wendell Pierce about his book, The Wind in the Reeds. When we come back, you'll hear what he said about The Wire, the Baltimore riots, and a story he immediately regretted telling. We'll be back in 60 seconds. We spent a lot of time talking with the actor and author Wendell Pierce about his book, The Wind in the Reeds, a gracefully written treatise on race in New Orleans with the dash of politics sprinkled in. Part of that time we spent talking about his experience filming The Wire in Baltimore and what he thought and felt after the Baltimore riots this year.
The first reaction was I realized how important another piece of art was, which is our examination of all the variables that were coming into play as we examined the dysfunction in Baltimore, as we examined all the elements that led up to what people saw in the uprising in Baltimore. We had been examining it, and that is the form of what art should do. What thoughts are to the individual, where we lie awake at night and reflect on who we are, where we're going. Art should be the forum where we collectively as a society reflect on who we are, where we've failed, where we've triumphed, declare what our values are, and then act on them. And that is the purpose of art. It is the most important thing that we do. Entertainment is just a byproduct, a residual of it. And art is in every discipline. In politics, it can be high art, technical proficiency and creativity existing at the same time, with the society reflecting on all of that together. In science, in all the different disciplines. And what you saw in Baltimore, we had been considering in that forum for 5 years on The Wire. That's why when it happened, everyone turned to actually people who had participated in it, and David Simon, and said, okay, you have been discussing this dysfunction, this moral ambiguity in our institutions and all, and now it has come to the forefront. And so now, in the same forum, this discussion that we're having, let's declare what is important to us and act on it. The thing that upset me the most, and upsets me about this whole journey of the past year and a half, of communities of color and underserved communities and the police, it's the fact that those who are doing the misconduct, who just happen to be wearing this badge, dishonor the badge. And what the multitude, the 99.9%, are doing right, we need to hear from them to say, first of all, don't call him a cop. Don't call her a cop. And we also need to, if we're going to have the discussion, let's be honest. Every cop in Baltimore knows what a riot is. Every cop in America. Not one cop in the media have I heard, it's called giving a kid a ride. You put him in cuffs, and then you speed up, and you give a short break, and they're going to bust their head on the window. Every cop in America knows that old school trick, but not one has ever said, mea culpa, it is a bad part of what we do. We need to change it. That's probably what happened to this kid. They gave him a ride. It's called giving somebody a ride. And we all know it, but we don't discuss it like that.
Let me ask you a practical question. I'm going to ask you about the three Democratic candidates. You're obviously a Democrat, big supporter of President Obama, still a supporter. Let me ask you about the three Democratic candidates. Just real quick, just give me a sense of what you think about the following three people. Hillary Clinton.
Hillary Clinton is poised to be the nominee of the party, and has a good chance of being the first woman president.
And you're happy about that?
I'm happy about that because it's all based on policy. It also is an evolution, a part of that. The only thing that we consider when it comes to her gender is the fact that we can actually have a discussion about her being qualified or not qualified as being president, and gender doesn't have anything to do with it.
Bernie Sanders?
Making an effective effort to have his points of view on the platform. He has to be considered,
And Martin O'Malley, a guy who obviously there's a character on The Wire modeled after. Martin O'Malley did not like that character. Did not like that character very much.
David Simon says it is not. He is not Carcetti. All right.
And yet. But what do you think about Martin O'Malley?
Doing the things necessary to build his political career.
That sounds a little skeptical.
Well, no, I think he's sincere. If he caught fire, he would be happy as president. But the fact is, this cycle is going to be for him to get his name out there, hopefully be considered for vice president as a part of the ticket. And also, we now know who he is.
You went to the White House Correspondents' Dinner in 2012.
Yes.
You took my friend Gwen Eiffel.
Yes, she took me. She honored me.
You guys went
yes.
together.
Yes.
Who was the most interesting person, or the person you were most excited to meet there, putting aside President Obama?
The most interesting thing that happened to me, though, was as I'm going down the receiving line, I see the Prime Minister looking out at the corner of his eye. I can't wait until I come to meet him, right? Yeah. And he's talking to the person, but he's really looking at me. Yeah. And then I step up and he goes, "Tell Dominic West I won." Because Dominic, I guess, at one point had dated formerly his wife.
Hilarious.
And so he was so waiting to tell Bunk, to tell McNulty,
right,
I won. Right. I said, I will make sure, Mr. Prime Minister, that he knows.
That is pretty funny.
Oh, my God. Maybe I shouldn't have said that.
No, you should definitely have said that. There's no doubt about it.
I'm actually on television. I'm not in your living room just talking to you.
Just think about it as my living room. As long as we're in my living room, so I wrap this up with literally the single most important discussion that we need to have, which relates to po' boys. And there's fierce disputation about the best po' boy in New Orleans. I need you to make a ruling.
Ooh.
Tell me if I'm coming next time I'm coming back. I want to have the best one. I'm going to wear.
Man, this
is going to be a hard decision because you're going to make someone unhappy.
Ooh, man. First of all, I mean that's like chili. That's like Philly cheesesteaks, Geno's or Pat.
If it's really too hard for you, you can give me 3.
I tell you. Anytime, any night, in any stage, hot sausage po' boy from Jeans.
Okay. Love that place. Love that place.
Parkway Grill.
Okay. Never been there.
You have to go.
Okay.
Parkway Grill. Wonderful.
Okay.
And then really, very mart in the French Quarter.
Okay.
Any time of day, any time of night. Those are the best places. But it just shows you the power of culture. Yeah. Because even in our culinary art, scraps from the table to make a debris po' boy, or scraps from the table put into a pot with burnt oil and flour, and you create this stew that's known around the world as gumbo. Yeah. Our culture is not only sustenance for the soul, but literal sustenance that you can feed yourself with.
One of the things that makes New Orleans so great, right? Because you got both. You got it all, man. There's the spiritual sustenance, the gastronomic sustenance, the musical sustenance, the whole thing.
It is the northernmost Caribbean city. It is the best description of the multitudes of American culture. It's all on display.
Our incredible thanks to Wendell Pierce. So I screwed that question up and it made a little confused. When I said the White House Correspondents' Dinner to Wendell, I was really talking about the state dinner at the White House for British Prime Minister David Cameron, which is why he was telling that story about David Cameron. So that clarifies that, I hope. And now we know that with this interview, Cameron ended up getting his message to McNulty after all. Anyway, go read the Wind and the Reads, and we'll be right back with your weekend political weather forecast after this.
We're expecting a busy weekend out there in election land, so let's go live to our weekend campaign forecast center where our chief political meteorologist Alexander Trowbridge is standing by. Tro, what's going on this weekend?
Mark, there's so much exciting activity this weekend that you'll be aching for more. Talking about Aiken, South Carolina, where Bernie will be rolling through a town hall there after striking Rock Hill in Columbia earlier in the day, part of an outreach to black voters. We're going to be monitoring this activity all weekend. Bernie also making an impact on ABC's This Week on Sunday morning. And later that day, he's going to crash into Las Vegas for an evening rally with Hispanic voters. Another thing to watch this weekend, a strong Trump force that's going to be dominating the air in New York City for an hour and a half on Saturday night. Musical guest Sia not going to be getting much rest overnight because we expect Trump phoners on at least 3 Sunday morning shows as well. Now, get ready for your Saturday lightning round. Bobby in Waukee, Iowa, O'Malley at a fall fundraiser in Burlington, and Carly at a house party in Bedford, New Hampshire, 60 miles from Christie at a Veterans Appreciation Breakfast in Plymouth. Now, that's your weekend. And remember, like an umbrella or Ken Goldstein on a down market radio ad buy, we have got you covered. Back to you.
Trump gets off the air at 1 in the morning, and then on the Sunday shows, it's going to be quite a Trumpathon.
Trumpathon. Also, I like the Bernie in Vegas story just because his people all think he's got to score with some minorities somewhere. Hispanic voters in that state, they really think is important. Could be a breakthrough for him in the caucuses there.
Hard to get better known there, but a lot going on this weekend, and we'll be back Monday to talk all about it.
We certainly will. We are on the Tube an hour every day at 5 and at 8. We're live 24/7 on BloombergPolitics.com. We've got John Meacham on Monday to discuss his new book on Bush 41. That's going to be awesome. Until then, I have one thing to say, just to clarify. Hot dogs are not sandwiches. Okay?
They are kind of like sandwiches.
They are not
sandwiches.
They're not sandwiches.
Thanks for watching. We'll see you Monday. Sayonara.